In the early 1950s, the world was divided by fear. The Soviets bragged about their missiles. America didn't know what was real, or how close nuclear war was. So, a handful of engineers built a plane that could touch the edge of space. They called it the U-2. The Soviets laughed at it. They said it would never fly. But one quiet morning, that impossible machine rose from a secret desert runway and crossed into Soviet airspace, straight toward Moscow. What it saw changed the Cold War forever. What happened next almost ended it. The year was 1953. Winston Churchill had coined the phrase Iron Curtain, but it might as well have been a blanket of darkness. Behind it, the Soviet Union was building something: missiles, bombs, an arsenal that could end civilization. But what exactly? How many? How powerful? America didn't know, and that ignorance was killing us slowly, one sleepless night at a time. In school gymnasiums across America, children practiced crawling under desks, as if wooden furniture could protect them from the fire of atoms. The practice was absurd, but the fear was real. Every Soviet boast about their unstoppable rockets sent another chill through Washington's corridors. Premier Nikita Khrushchev loved to laugh at American capitalism, at American weakness, at American ignorance. In Red Square, he stood before massive missiles during military parades, his round face beaming with pride and mockery. "We will bury you," he declared to Western diplomats, his words carrying across the Atlantic like a death threat wrapped in a smile. But the most humiliating part wasn't the threats, it was the laughter. Soviet pilots, interviewed by their own propaganda machine, would joke about American aircraft. "Their planes are toys," one pilot sneered into the camera. "Fragile toys that cannot reach our homeland. Let them come. We will swat them from the sky like flies." The laughter echoed in the Kremlin. It echoed in Soviet air bases across Eastern Europe. And it echoed, most painfully, in the Pentagon. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had commanded D-Day, had stared down Hitler's war machine, had orchestrated the liberation of Europe. But this enemy was different. This enemy was invisible. In the Oval Office, intelligence briefings became exercises in educated guessing. How many intercontinental ballistic missiles did the Soviets have? The estimates ranged from dozens to hundreds. Some analysts whispered about thousands. "Mr. President," his CIA director would say, spreading grainy satellite photos across the mahogany desk, "we simply don't know." The missile gap, that's what they called it. The terrifying possibility that America was falling behind in the race for nuclear supremacy. Congressional hearings erupted with demands for action. Newspapers screamed headlines about Soviet superiority. The American public, still celebrating their victory in World War II, suddenly found themselves living in fear of annihilation. Eisenhower knew the truth was simpler and more complex than anyone realized. America needed eyes. They needed to see behind the Iron Curtain, to count the missiles, to separate Soviet boasts from Soviet reality. But how do you see into a nation that shoots down anything that crosses its borders? The traditional spy satellites were still science fiction, years away from reality. U-2 reconnaissance flights existed, but they were limited to the periphery, photographing radar installations along borders, never penetrating deep into Soviet territory. "What we need," Eisenhower told his advisors, "is a plane that can fly higher than their missiles can reach." The Pentagon's response was swift and dismissive. "Impossible, Mr. President. The Soviets have missiles that can reach 60,000 feet. No manned aircraft can fly higher and survive." But across the country, in the stark landscape of Southern California, a small group of engineers was already proving the Pentagon wrong. Clarence Leonard Kelly Johnson was not a dreamer. He was a builder of dreams. Short, stocky, with the intense focus of a man who saw problems as puzzles waiting to be solved, Johnson had already revolutionized aviation multiple times over. His Lockheed P-38 Lightning had turned the tide in the Pacific. His F-80 Shooting Star had introduced America to the jet age. His F-104 Starfighter could touch Mach 2 and climb into the stratosphere like a rocket with wings. But this request was different. This was madness disguised as engineering. The CIA had approached him quietly, secretly, through channels that officially didn't exist. They needed an aircraft that could fly at 70,000 feet, higher than any Soviet missile, higher than any manned aircraft had ever sustained flight. It needed to carry cameras that could photograph a newspaper headline from 13 miles up, and it needed to be invisible to radar. Oh, and they needed it in 18 months. "Kelly," his assistant had said, reviewing the specifications, "this is impossible." Johnson looked up from his drafting table, pencil still moving across the blueprint. "Good," he said. "Impossible means the Russians aren't building one." While Johnson worked in secrecy, Soviet confidence grew more brazen by the day. In Moscow, military leaders held press conferences showcasing their latest missiles. In satellite states across Eastern Europe, new launch facilities appeared monthly. The message was clear. The Soviet Union was ascendant, unstoppable, untouchable. At aviation conferences, Soviet engineers would speak dismissively of American technology. "The Americans build planes like they build cars," one prominent designer told a gathering in Prague. "Flashy, complicated, unreliable. Real aircraft must be simple, rugged, designed for war, not for show." When rumors reached Moscow about an American high-altitude reconnaissance program, the laughter became louder. "Let them waste their money," Khrushchev reportedly told his defense minister. "Let them build their thin-air toys. Our missiles reach the edge of space itself. Nothing flies over the Soviet Union without our permission." Soviet radar operators received new standing orders. Any unidentified aircraft crossing Soviet airspace was to be destroyed immediately. No warnings, no mercy. The message needed to be clear to Washington. Soviet airspace was inviolate. But there was a problem with Soviet confidence. It was about to meet American ingenuity. In the Mojave Desert of Southern California, on land that officially didn't exist, Kelly Johnson was building the impossible. He called his team the Skunk Works, a reference to the mysterious distillery in the Lil Abner comic strip. Just 80 engineers, working in a hangar that looked like it could barely house a crop duster, building an aircraft that would redefine the limits of flight. The U-2, officially designated the utility aircraft to maintain its cover, was unlike anything that had ever been conceived. It had the wingspan of a small airliner, but weighed less than a sports car. Its single engine was powerful enough to lift it into the stratosphere, yet efficient enough to keep it there for hours. Most importantly, it was designed to be a ghost. The U-2's radar signature was smaller than a bird's. Its engine exhaust dissipated in the thin air of high altitude, leaving virtually no heat signature. Its sleek black paint absorbed radar waves rather than reflecting them. From the ground, even in broad daylight, it was nearly invisible. From 70,000 feet up, it might as well have been flying on another planet. But building it required solving 1,000 smaller impossibilities. At 70,000 feet, there is no oxygen to breathe. The pilots would need full pressure suits like astronauts. The cockpit would need to be pressurized and heated, but also light enough not to compromise the aircraft's performance. At 70,000 feet, the air is so thin that normal engines would starve for oxygen. Johnson's team had to redesign everything: fuel injection, air intake, exhaust systems, for an environment that barely existed on Earth. At 70,000 feet, the slightest structural failure would be instantly fatal. The aircraft's skin had to be strong enough to withstand the pressure differential, light enough to reach altitude, and flexible enough to expand and contract as it moved between the heat of ground level and the freezing cold of the stratosphere. Every problem seemed impossible. Johnson's team solved them all. But the most impossible challenge wasn't engineering. It was secrecy. The U-2 couldn't officially exist. The pilots couldn't officially exist. The base where it operated couldn't officially exist. If the Soviets ever shot one down, the American government would need plausible deniability. So the pilots were officially civilian weather researchers. The aircraft were officially atmospheric research vehicles. And the base, a patch of Nevada desert that would later become famous as Area 51, officially wasn't on any map. Johnson's team worked 18-hour days, 7 days a week, building a plane that their own government would never acknowledge. They solved problems that aerospace engineers said couldn't be solved. They built systems that physics said shouldn't work. And on a scorching morning in August 1955, they rolled the first U-2 onto a makeshift runway in the Nevada desert and prepared to find out if their impossible dream could actually fly. The Soviets were still laughing. They wouldn't be laughing much longer. August 1st, 1955. The Mojave Desert shimmered in the pre-dawn heat, but test pilot Tony Levier had ice in his veins. Before him sat the strangest aircraft he'd ever seen, all wing and elegance, black as midnight, perched on bicycle-style landing gear like some prehistoric bird. The U-2 looked fragile enough to break in a strong wind, but Kelly Johnson's calculations said it could climb higher than any aircraft in history. "Tony," Johnson said, his hand on the pilot's shoulder, "just take her up for a quick hop. Get a feel for the controls. Don't try to climb today." Levier nodded, but his eyes were fixed on the endless sky above. Every test pilot carried the same disease, the need to push boundaries, to discover what lay beyond the edge of known flight. The engine spooled up with a whisper rather than a roar. At ground level, the J-57 turbojet was barely breathing in the thick air it was designed to escape. But as Levier released the brakes and began his takeoff roll, something magical happened. The U-2 didn't just take off, it levitated. At 60 knots, a speed where most aircraft were still accelerating down the runway, the U-2 was already airborne, climbing at an angle that seemed to mock gravity itself. Levier intended to level off at a few thousand feet for basic handling tests. Instead, he found himself at 28,000 feet before he could blink. "Jesus, Kelly," he radioed down to the ground. "This thing wants to go to the moon." From the ground, Johnson watched his impossible dream validate itself. The U-2 wasn't just flying. It was soaring into regions of atmosphere where no manned aircraft had ever sustained flight. And it was doing so with an ease that made conventional fighters look like lead weights. But as Levier tried to bring the aircraft back down, he discovered the U-2's most dangerous characteristic. In the thin air of high altitude, it had 2 flight speeds. Too slow, and it would stall and fall from the sky. Too fast, and it would tear itself apart. The margin between these speeds, what pilots called the coffin corner, was razor thin. At 70,000 feet, a U-2 pilot had perhaps 5 knots of breathing room between catastrophic stall and catastrophic overspeed. Flying the U-2 wasn't just difficult, it was a form of high-altitude ballet, where every movement had to be precise, deliberate, and perfect. "Kelly," Levier said after his first flight, his hands still shaking slightly from adrenaline, "we just built a plane that can see God." Within weeks, the U-2 had a nickname that would follow it through history, the Dragon Lady. Like the comic strip character of the same name, it was beautiful, mysterious, and potentially deadly to those who underestimated it. But beauty meant nothing if the aircraft couldn't deliver on its promise. The CIA needed photographs, crystal-clear images of Soviet military installations from 13 miles up. They needed to count missiles, identify radar installations, map nuclear facilities. The cameras Johnson's team installed were marvels of Cold War engineering. Weighing nearly a ton, they contained enough film to photograph a strip of territory 2,500 miles long and 500 miles wide. The lenses were so powerful they could distinguish between a car and a truck from the edge of space. More importantly, they could count missiles. The first test flights over Nevada and California produced images that stunned intelligence analysts. From 70,000 feet, the U-2's cameras could photograph individual aircraft parked at Edwards Air Force Base with such clarity that analysts could read the tail numbers. "My God," one CIA photo interpreter whispered, studying the first batch of images. "We can see everything." But seeing everything came with a price. At 70,000 feet, a pilot wasn't just flying. He was surviving in an environment more hostile than the surface of Mars. The pressure suit was a torture device disguised as protective equipment. Heavy, restrictive, and uncomfortable, it turned every flight into an endurance test. Pilots couldn't scratch an itch, couldn't wipe their nose, couldn't even turn their head without planning the movement carefully. The cockpit was equally unforgiving. Cramped, noisy, and subject to wild temperature variations as the aircraft climbed from desert heat to stratospheric cold, it felt more like a space capsule than an airplane. And if something went wrong at 70,000 feet, there was no help coming. "You're on your own up there," Johnson told his pilots during training. "No fighter can reach you. No rescue helicopter can climb that high. If the Dragon Lady decides to kill you, you'll have about 90 seconds to figure out how to save yourself." Despite the dangers, pilots lined up to fly the U-2. For test pilots, it represented the ultimate challenge, flying in an environment where the margin for error was measured in heartbeats. In July 1956, the U-2 made its first overflight of Soviet territory. The pilot was Harvey Stockman, a former Air Force test pilot who had been recruited by the CIA under a cover story so thin it was barely worth maintaining. The mission profile was simple in concept, terrifying in execution. Take off from a secret base in West Germany, fly northeast across Poland and into Soviet airspace, photograph military installations around Leningrad and Moscow, then continue west to land in Norway. From the moment Stockman crossed into Soviet airspace, he was flying through the most heavily defended region on Earth. Below him, Soviet radar operators tracked what they called the ghost signal, a contact that appeared and disappeared seemingly at random, moving at impossible speeds and altitudes. MiG-15 fighters scrambled to intercept, but Stockman was flying in a different world. At 70,000 feet, he was 20,000 feet above the maximum altitude of Soviet interceptors. He could see the fighters climbing desperately below him, their contrails marking their futile attempts to reach him. "They look like ants," Stockman radioed to his handlers, using coded language that wouldn't reveal his true mission if intercepted. "Angry ants." For 6 hours, Stockman flew over the most secret installations of the Soviet military. His cameras captured images of airfields, missile sites, naval bases, and research facilities that the West had never seen. From Leningrad to Moscow, from the Baltic Sea to the Ural Mountains, the U-2 photographed everything. When Soviet fighters finally gave up their futile pursuit, Stockman was already over Norway, descending toward a landing strip that would welcome him like a returning astronaut. The film canisters from that first mission contained more intelligence about Soviet military capabilities than the CIA had gathered in the previous decade combined. But more importantly, they revealed something that shocked Washington. There was no missile gap. The photographs told a story that contradicted every Soviet boast, every intelligence estimate, every fearful projection about Soviet nuclear superiority. The U-2 had seen behind the Iron Curtain, and the view was surprising. Yes, the Soviets had missiles, but not hundreds, not thousands, dozens, perhaps. Most of their missile bases were still under construction. Some were clearly fake, elaborate deceptions designed to fool American satellites and reconnaissance flights. The much vaunted Soviet bomber force, mostly obsolete aircraft that wouldn't survive a first encounter with modern American fighters. The massive nuclear arsenal, real but not nearly as advanced or extensive as Soviet propaganda claimed. "Mr. President," CIA Director Allen Dulles told Eisenhower, spreading the U-2 photographs across the desk in the Oval Office, "the missile gap is a myth. We're ahead of them, not behind." Eisenhower studied the images with the careful eye of a former military commander. Every missile site, every radar installation, every military base that Soviet propagandists had claimed was impregnable was now laid bare in black and white photographs. But the president also understood the political implications. For years, politicians had been demanding massive increases in defense spending to close the missile gap. Defense contractors had built their business plans around Soviet superiority. The American public had been living in fear of a Soviet nuclear advantage that simply didn't exist. "Allen," Eisenhower said quietly, "this information never leaves this room. If we reveal what we know, we also reveal how we know it, and then we lose our eyes in the sky." The U-2 photographs became some of the most highly classified documents in American history. They couldn't be shared with Congress. They couldn't be used to reassure the American public. They couldn't even be acknowledged to exist. So America continued to live in fear of a Soviet advantage that had been disproven from 70,000 feet above the very installations they were supposed to fear. Mission after mission, the U-2 proved its worth. Flights over Eastern Europe mapped Soviet radar networks with precision that astonished intelligence analysts. Overflights of nuclear facilities revealed the true state of Soviet atomic research, advanced, but not as advanced as feared. Most importantly, the U-2 was untouchable. Soviet fighters tried desperately to intercept the high-flying spy plane, but their efforts were futile. The MiG-17s and MiG-19s could reach perhaps 50,000 feet on a good day. The U-2 operated routinely at 70,000 feet, in an environment where even the most advanced Soviet interceptors became helpless. Surface-to-air missiles were equally useless. The SA-1 and SA-2 systems that ringed Moscow and other critical targets were designed to destroy bombers flying at 30,000 to 40,000 feet. Against an aircraft flying at the edge of space, they were as effective as throwing rocks. "We own the sky," one U-2 pilot reported after a mission over Kiev. "They can see us, but they can't touch us." But Soviet pride was being systematically humiliated, one overflight at a time. In the Kremlin, Premier Khrushchev raged at his defense ministers. "How can the most powerful military in the world be helpless against a single American plane?" he demanded. "Find a way to stop these intrusions, or find new jobs." Soviet aircraft designers worked frantically to develop interceptors capable of reaching 70,000 feet. Missile designers pushed their systems to achieve higher and higher altitudes. Radar specialists labored to improve tracking of high-altitude targets. But for now, the U-2 remained untouchable, a ghost that haunted Soviet airspace at will. American confidence grew with each successful mission. Intelligence analysts began planning even more ambitious overflights. Military planners discussed using the U-2's invincibility to gather intelligence on Soviet nuclear facilities, submarine bases, and research installations. The impossible plane had become, in the minds of its operators, truly invincible. That confidence would prove to be the most dangerous illusion of all. Francis Gary Powers was not a romantic figure. Thin, quiet, methodical, he looked more like an accountant than a spy pilot who would change the course of the Cold War. But beneath his unassuming exterior beat the heart of a man who could fly higher than eagles and remain calm while enemy missiles exploded below him. Powers was part of an elite group of CIA pilots who had been recruited from the military under cover stories that wouldn't fool a determined journalist. Officially, they were civilian weather researchers working for a company that didn't exist, flying aircraft that weren't in any catalog. Unofficially, they were some of the most skilled pilots in the world, trained to operate in an environment so hostile that a single mistake would be instantly fatal. "Gentlemen," their instructor had told them during training at a base that wasn't on any map, "you're not just flying an airplane, you're flying a spacecraft that happens to have wings. At 70,000 feet, you're closer to space than you are to the ground." The training was unlike anything in conventional aviation. Pilots learned to fly in full-pressure suits, communicate through radio systems designed to avoid Soviet interception, and navigate using celestial navigation techniques that wouldn't have been out of place on a 19th-century sailing ship. Most importantly, they learned what to do if the impossible happened. If the Dragon Lady fell from the sky. If you're shot down over Soviet territory, their briefing officer explained with clinical detachment, you have two choices. Use the poison needle sewn into your flight suit, or prepare for interrogation that will make our training exercises look like a children's game. Powers preferred not to think about either option. The briefing room at Peshawar Air Base in Pakistan was stifling in the pre-dawn heat. Powers sat across from his mission commanders, studying photographs and maps that revealed the route he would fly on what intelligence officers were calling the most important reconnaissance mission of the Cold War. "Gary," the mission commander said, his finger tracing a red line across a map of the Soviet Union, "this is the big one. We're going all the way across, Tyuratam to Murmansk, with a photography run over Sverdlovsk." Powers studied the route. It would take him over the most sensitive military installations in the Soviet Union, the Tyuratam missile test facility where Soviet ICBMs were launched, nuclear research facilities in the Ural Mountains, and submarine bases on the Arctic coast. More than 2,800 miles of Soviet territory. 9 hours in the cockpit. 9 hours of flying through the most heavily defended airspace on Earth. Intelligence priority is the missile facilities, the briefing officer continued. Washington needs to know what they're really building at Churitum. The submarine bases are secondary, but photograph everything you can. Powers nodded, but his attention was focused on the timeline. May Day 1960, the most important Soviet holiday, when the entire military would be on high alert for the massive parade in Red Square. Sir, Powers said quietly, May Day seems like an odd choice for this mission. Won't their defenses be at maximum readiness? The mission commander smiled grimly. That's exactly why we're going today, Gary. Their radar operators will be distracted by the parade preparations. Their fighters will be busy with ceremonial flyovers, and their missile crews will be focused on Moscow, not watching for intruders. It was logical, but Powers couldn't shake the feeling that they were pushing their luck. For 4 years, the U-2 had been invincible. No Soviet fighter had come close to reaching them. No missile had threatened them. But every pilot understood that luck was a finite resource. One more thing, Gary, the briefing officer added, almost as an afterthought. Intelligence reports that the Soviets have been working on improved surface-to-air missiles. We don't think they're operational yet, but keep an eye out for unusual SAM activity. Powers signed the mission documents, said his customary prayer, and walked out into the Pakistani dawn toward the aircraft that would either make him a hero or a footnote in Cold War history. At 06:26 local time, Powers pushed the throttles forward and began his takeoff roll from Peshawar. The U-2 lifted off with its usual grace, climbing rapidly into the clear morning sky above Pakistan. By 0700 he was at 66,000 feet and climbing, his aircraft invisible to ground observers and nearly invisible to radar. Below him, the harsh landscape of Afghanistan scrolled past in brown and tan abstractions. At 0715, Powers crossed into Soviet airspace. Immediately, Soviet radar operators began tracking what they called Track 44, an unidentified aircraft moving at high speed and impossible altitude through the most restricted airspace in the world. In command centers across the Soviet Union, red telephones began ringing. Fighter pilots scrambled to their aircraft. Missile crews ran to their stations. But Powers, flying in his pressurized cocoon 70,000 feet above the Earth, was unaware of the chaos below. His world had contracted to the size of a cockpit barely larger than a phone booth, where every breath came from an oxygen system, every heartbeat was amplified by the pressure suit, and every view outside showed the curvature of the Earth itself. Like flying in space, he murmured into his radio, using coded language to report his position to handlers who were monitoring his progress from stations thousands of miles away. At 0830, Powers reached the Churitum missile facility, the heart of Soviet ICBM development. His cameras began their methodical work, photographing launch pads, assembly buildings, and missile storage facilities with resolution so sharp that analysts would later be able to count the rivets on individual rockets. Below him, Soviet fighters climbed desperately toward his altitude. MiG-19s pushed their engines to maximum power, clawing for height that remained impossibly beyond their reach. Their contrails marked their frustration, white lines that topped out at 55,000 feet, while Powers flew serenely above them at 70,000. "They're trying," Powers radioed to his handlers, watching the fighters far below. "But they might as well be trying to catch the moon." For 3 hours, Powers flew deeper into Soviet territory, his cameras documenting secrets that had been hidden behind the Iron Curtain since the end of World War II. Nuclear facilities, missile bases, radar installations, all laid bare in black and white photographs that would reshape Western understanding of Soviet capabilities. At 11:30, he reached Sverdlovsk, a closed city in the Ural Mountains where Soviet engineers were developing the next generation of intercontinental ballistic missiles. It was there that 4 years of invincibility finally came to an end. At 14,000 meters above Sverdlovsk, Francis Gary Powers was thinking about lunch. 3.5 hours into his mission, with 6 hours still to go. He was settling into the meditation-like trance that U-2 pilots used to cope with the isolation and discomfort of high-altitude flight. His cameras were working perfectly, systematically photographing the military installations below. His aircraft was performing flawlessly, its single engine purring with the efficiency that had made the U-2 legendary. In the distance, he could see the contrails of Soviet fighters climbing toward him, another futile attempt to reach the untouchable spy plane. Then the sky exploded. The SA-2 surface-to-air missile that struck the U-2 was part of a new generation of Soviet weapons, designed specifically to counter high-altitude threats. Unlike earlier missiles, the SA-2 could reach altitudes above 70,000 feet. And unlike earlier attempts to shoot down the U-2, this one had been carefully planned and precisely executed. The aircraft just disappeared. Powers would later testify. One moment I was flying normally, the next moment I was tumbling through space in pieces of what used to be an airplane. The missile's proximity fuse had detonated just behind the U-2's tail, the explosion severing control surfaces and rupturing fuel lines. The Dragon Lady, so graceful and invincible at altitude, became a falling collection of metal and fire. Powers found himself thrown forward in his seat, watching his instrument panel disintegrate and feeling the aircraft enter an uncontrollable spin toward the ground 70,000 feet below. His training kicked in with mechanical precision. He reached for the ejection seat handle, then hesitated. Ejecting at 70,000 feet would mean plummeting through an atmosphere so thin that his body would essentially be in freefall for several minutes before his parachute could function. But staying with the aircraft meant certain death. Powers pulled the handle. The ejection seat fired, launching him into the thin air of the stratosphere. For long, terrifying moments he fell through space, watching the wreckage of his aircraft tumbling beside him toward the Soviet landscape below. His parachute opened at 15,000 feet, and Powers found himself floating down into the heart of the Soviet Union. A CIA pilot carrying some of the most sensitive intelligence materials in American history, about to land in the hands of the KGB. Below him, Soviet citizens were already converging on the crash site, drawn by the thunderous sound of the explosion and the spectacular sight of wreckage falling from the clear spring sky. The invincible spy plane was down. The pilot was alive, and the Cold War was about to take a turn toward crisis that would bring the world closer to nuclear war than anyone had imagined possible. As Powers descended under his parachute, he had time to consider the magnitude of what had just happened. For 4 years, the U-2 program had operated in perfect secrecy. The Soviet Union knew American spy planes were overflying their territory, but they had no proof, no pilot, no wreckage to display to the world. Now they had all three. Powers reached for the poison needle sewn into his flight suit, a quick, painless death that would prevent him from being captured and interrogated. For a moment he held the needle, feeling its weight and considering the choice between certain death and probable torture. Then he put it away. "I'm not ready to die today," he said to himself, watching the Soviet landscape grow larger below him. His parachute carried him down into a forest clearing near Sverdlovsk, where he was immediately surrounded by Soviet civilians who had witnessed the explosion. They treated him with curious respect rather than hostility, a strange foreign pilot who had fallen from the sky on the most important Soviet holiday. Within hours, KGB agents arrived to take Powers into custody. They were professional, almost polite, as they confiscated his equipment and began the process that would turn a routine reconnaissance mission into an international crisis. But the most significant aspect of Powers' capture wasn't what the Soviets gained. It was what the Americans lost. For 4 years, the U-2 program had given the United States an enormous intelligence advantage. American leaders knew the true state of Soviet military capabilities, while Soviet leaders could only guess at American strength. Now the balance had shifted. The Soviets had captured not just a pilot and an aircraft, but also the cameras and film that revealed American intelligence capabilities. They knew what the Americans had seen, what they had learned, and how they had learned it. Most importantly, They now had proof of American espionage that they could display to the world. In Moscow, the mood in the Kremlin shifted from embarrassment to triumph in a matter of hours. For 4 years, Soviet leaders had endured the humiliation of watching American spy planes cross their territory at will, photographing their most sensitive installations while Soviet forces stood helplessly below. Now, they had their revenge. Premier Khrushchev himself came to view the wreckage of the U-2, his round face beaming with satisfaction as he examined the twisted metal and sophisticated cameras that had been pulled from the crash site. "So," he said to his defense minister, "this is the invincible American spy plane. It looks quite vincible to me." The laughter that had greeted the U-2's first flights returned, but now it carried a different tone. Instead of the nervous laughter of the powerless, it was the confident laughter of the victor. Soviet propaganda moved quickly to exploit the victory. Within hours, newspapers across the Soviet bloc were trumpeting the heroic destruction of the American aggressor aircraft. Television broadcasts showed the wreckage, the captured pilot, and the sophisticated espionage equipment that had been stealing Soviet secrets for the imperialist warmongers. But Khrushchev was too smart to reveal everything at once. He understood that the greatest weapon he now possessed was American ignorance about what the Soviets knew. So he waited. He let American officials make statements about weather research flights and navigation errors. He let them dig themselves deeper into lies that he could demolish with a single photograph of Francis Gary Powers in Soviet custody. The trap was set. All Khrushchev had to do was spring it at the perfect moment. That moment came sooner than anyone expected. President Eisenhower was in the Oval Office when the call came. CIA Director Allen Dulles' voice was tight with tension as he delivered the news that would reshape American foreign policy. "Mr. President, we've lost contact with Mission 44. Powers was supposed to land in Norway 3 hours ago. He never arrived." Eisenhower set down his pen and stared at the intelligence briefing that had been describing routine Soviet military activities. Suddenly, nothing seemed routine anymore. "What's the probability he made it out?" Eisenhower asked. Dulles paused. In the world of intelligence, silence often conveyed more than words. "Sir, if he had mechanical trouble, he would have radioed. If he had weather problems, he would have diverted to an alternate landing site. The fact that he simply disappeared suggests the worst-case scenario." The worst-case scenario. The invincible spy plane had been shot down over the heart of the Soviet Union, carrying a pilot who knew enough secrets to compromise American intelligence operations worldwide. Within hours, the cover story was in motion. The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, issued a carefully crafted press release about a weather research aircraft that had experienced oxygen system difficulties while conducting atmospheric studies over Turkey. The pilot, a civilian employee of Lockheed Aircraft Corporation, was forced to use emergency oxygen procedures. The NASA statement explained, "It is possible that the pilot experienced difficulties which resulted in an inadvertent border crossing." It was a lie built on careful truths. Powers was indeed a civilian employee, technically. The U-2 did conduct atmospheric research as a secondary mission. Oxygen system problems were indeed possible at high altitude, but it was still a lie, and Khrushchev knew it. For 3 days, Khrushchev watched American officials elaborate on their fiction. State Department spokesman Lincoln White told reporters that there was absolutely no deliberate attempt to violate Soviet airspace. NASA officials provided detailed explanations of weather research procedures and emergency protocols. Each statement was carefully documented by Soviet intelligence, each lie recorded for future use. On May 5, 1960, Khrushchev addressed the Supreme Soviet in a speech that would be remembered as one of the most dramatic moments of the Cold War. Standing before the assembled representatives of the Soviet government, he began with apparent restraint. "Comrades, I must report to you on a serious violation of Soviet airspace by an American military aircraft." In Washington, officials breathed a sigh of relief. This was manageable. Khrushchev was being relatively restrained, apparently accepting the weather research story. Then Khrushchev smiled. "I must tell you a secret," he continued, his voice taking on a tone of theatrical revelation. "When I made my report, I deliberately did not say that the pilot was alive and well, and that we have got the remains of the plane." The silence in the Soviet Assembly Hall was matched by the silence in American government offices, where officials watched the speech with growing horror. "We did this quite deliberately," Khrushchev explained, "because we had set the Americans a trap. We wanted to see what silly story they would cook up." He paused for effect, looking directly into the television cameras that would carry his words around the world. And indeed, they invented a silly, stupid story. The revelation hit Washington like a nuclear explosion. In a matter of minutes, 4 years of careful operational security had been destroyed. The secret program that had given America unprecedented intelligence about Soviet capabilities was now exposed to the world. But the immediate crisis was larger than intelligence gathering. The Paris summit, a carefully planned meeting between Eisenhower and Khrushchev that was supposed to ease Cold War tensions, was scheduled to begin in just 10 days. "Mr. President," Secretary of State Christian Herter told Eisenhower in an emergency meeting, "we have to assume that Khrushchev will use this incident to destroy the summit. He's humiliated us internationally. He's proven that we've been lying to our allies. And he's demonstrated that Soviet air defenses are more capable than we thought." Eisenhower stared out the window of the Oval Office, watching the spring rain fall on the Rose Garden. The man who had commanded the Allied invasion of Europe, who had stared down Hitler's war machine, was facing a crisis that could spiral into nuclear war. "What does Powers know?" Eisenhower asked quietly. "Everything, sir. Mission routes, aircraft capabilities, intelligence priorities, operational procedures. If they break him under interrogation." The president didn't need the sentence finished. Powers knew enough to compromise not just the U-2 program, but American intelligence operations around the world. In Moscow, Khrushchev was facing his own dilemma. The downing of the U-2 had been a tremendous propaganda victory, but it also represented a dangerous escalation. American spy planes had been violating Soviet airspace for 4 years. Now that the violations were public knowledge, what would the United States do? Would they cancel future spy flights? Would they accelerate them? Or would they resort to more aggressive methods of intelligence gathering? "Comrade Premier," his defense minister asked during a Kremlin meeting, "how should we respond if the Americans send more spy planes?" Khrushchev's answer was swift and decisive. "We shoot them down, all of them, and we display the wreckage in Red Square." Paris in May 1960 should have been the setting for a diplomatic breakthrough. The Palais de l'Élysée, with its ornate halls and manicured gardens, had been prepared for meetings that might ease the tensions that had divided East and West for 15 years. Instead, it became the stage for one of the most dramatic diplomatic failures of the Cold War. Eisenhower arrived in Paris knowing that his presidency's foreign policy legacy was in ruins. The man who had ended the Korean War and avoided nuclear confrontation with the Soviet Union was now facing a crisis that could destroy any hope of peaceful coexistence. Khrushchev arrived like a conquering hero, basking in the international praise for Soviet technical achievements and American humiliation. Soviet delegates spoke openly about the collapse of American credibility and the exposure of imperialist aggression. The first session was scheduled for May 16th. Eisenhower, Khrushchev, British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan, and French President Charles de Gaulle were to meet in the same room where the Treaty of Versailles had been signed 41 years earlier. Instead, Khrushchev stood before the assembled world press and delivered what amounted to a declaration of diplomatic war. The Soviet government considers that as long as the United States government does not condemn the inadmissible provocative actions of the U.S. Air Force with regard to the Soviet Union, does not state that it will refrain from continuing such actions against the USSR, the Soviet government sees no possibility for productive negotiations with the United States government at the summit conference. Then came the personal attack that made reconciliation impossible. "We cannot sit at the same table with those who plan treacherous surprise attacks against us." Eisenhower, his face flushed with controlled anger, stood to respond. But his words carried the weight of a man who knew his political career was ending in humiliation. The United States government has suspended all U-2 overflights of the Soviet Union and does not intend to resume them. It was too little, too late. Khrushchev had already made his decision. I withdraw my invitation for President Eisenhower to visit the Soviet Union, he announced. Such a visit would not serve the cause of peace. With those words, the Paris summit collapsed before it had truly begun. While diplomats postured in Paris, Francis Gary Powers sat in a Moscow prison cell, preparing for a trial that would be broadcast to the world as a propaganda spectacle. The Soviets had treated him well, better in many ways than American prisoners of war had been treated in previous conflicts. But the psychological pressure was constant and methodical. "Mr. Powers," his interrogator said during one of their daily sessions, "you must understand your situation. You have been captured conducting espionage against the Soviet Union. Under Soviet law, this is punishable by death." Powers, who had been trained to resist interrogation, found himself in an impossible position. The Soviets already had his aircraft, his cameras, and his film. They knew what missions he had flown and what intelligence he had gathered. Denying the obvious would only make his situation worse. "I was following orders," Powers replied. "I was a pilot. I went where they told me to go." It was a reasonable defense, but it carried little weight in a Soviet courtroom where the verdict had been decided before the trial began. On August 17, 1960, Powers stood trial in the Hall of Columns in Moscow, the same room where Stalin had conducted his show trials of political enemies in the 1930s. The proceedings were broadcast live on Soviet television and radio, providing the world with a detailed examination of American espionage methods. "Francis Gary Powers," the judge declared, "you are charged with espionage against the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics under Article 2 of the Law of the USSR of December 25, 1958. Powers pleaded guilty. His Soviet defense attorney argued for mercy, claiming that Powers was a victim of American militarism rather than a willing spy. The prosecutor demanded the death penalty. For 17 days, the trial provided the Soviet Union with a platform to expose American intelligence operations while portraying Powers as a symbol of American aggression. Witnesses testified about the technical capabilities of the U-2, the intelligence value of the photographs it had taken, and the violation of Soviet sovereignty that the overflights represented. Powers himself became an unexpected figure of sympathy. Calm, dignified, and apparently remorseful, he bore little resemblance to the aggressive spy that Soviet propaganda had promised. On August 19th, the court announced its verdict. Francis Gary Powers was guilty of espionage and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He would serve less than 2. Glienicke Bridge, spanning the Havel River between West Berlin and Potsdam, had become known as the Bridge of Spies for its role in Cold War prisoner exchanges. On the foggy morning of February 10, 1962, it would earn that nickname once again. Francis Gary Powers stood on the American side of the bridge, flanked by CIA agents who had negotiated his release. Across the bridge, Soviet Colonel Rudolf Abel, a master spy who had been captured and convicted in New York, waited with his KGB handlers. The exchange was simple in concept, complex in execution. At precisely 8:52 a.m., both men began walking across the bridge toward their respective freedoms. Powers had aged visibly during his 21 months in Soviet captivity. The confident test pilot who had climbed into the U-2 on that May morning in 1960 was now a symbol of American vulnerability, a reminder that even the most sophisticated technology could not guarantee invincibility. "Gary," his CIA escort said as they walked across the bridge, "you're going home." But home was no longer the place Powers remembered. His wife had divorced him. His government had initially disavowed him. His fellow pilots questioned whether he should have used the poison needle rather than allow himself to be captured. The hero's welcome he might have expected never materialized. Instead, Powers found himself facing congressional hearings, media scrutiny, and public skepticism about his actions during and after his capture. The man who had flown higher than any human in history discovered that falling from 70,000 feet was nothing compared to falling from grace. In the aftermath of the U-2 crisis, both superpowers began to reassess their approaches to intelligence gathering and Cold War confrontation. The Soviet Union had proven that American technical superiority was not absolute. The SA-2 missile system that had brought down Powers' aircraft became the foundation for air defense systems that would challenge American air power for decades to come. More importantly, the Soviets had demonstrated that they could match American technological achievements when they focused their resources on specific challenges. The space program that would put Yuri Gagarin into orbit just 11 months after Powers' shootdown was a direct descendant of the missile technology that had reached into the stratosphere to destroy the invincible U-2. For the United States, the crisis marked the end of an era of unquestioned technological superiority. The country that had ended World War II with atomic weapons and had maintained nuclear supremacy through the early 1950s now faced a Soviet Union that could challenge American capabilities in space, in the air, and on the ground. President Eisenhower, in his final year in office, watched his foreign policy legacy crumble. The man who had warned about the military-industrial complex in his farewell address had become its victim, trapped by intelligence programs that promised perfect security but delivered international humiliation. The loss of the summit meeting was a great disappointment to me, Eisenhower would later write. I had looked forward to making a start toward better relations between East and West. Instead, the U-2 crisis had pushed the superpowers further apart, setting the stage for confrontations that would bring the world to the brink of nuclear war. The downing of Francis Gary Powers' U-2 marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. For 4 years, manned aircraft had been the primary means of gathering intelligence about Soviet military capabilities. The U-2's invincibility had given American leaders unprecedented insight into Soviet strengths and weaknesses. Now that invincibility was shattered, and both superpowers began looking toward space for their intelligence gathering. The first successful American reconnaissance satellite, Corona, achieved orbit just 4 months after Powers' shootdown. Unlike the U-2, satellites could not be shot down by conventional weapons. Unlike human pilots, they could not be captured and put on trial for the world to see. But they also could not adapt to changing circumstances, could not loiter over targets of opportunity, could not provide the real-time intelligence that had made the U-2 so valuable. We traded precision for invulnerability, one intelligence analyst observed years later. The satellites could see everything, but they couldn't think about what they were seeing. The age of the spy pilot was ending, replaced by an age of automated intelligence gathering that would reshape not just espionage, but the nature of warfare itself. Kelly Johnson, the engineer who had created the impossible plane, watched the changing world with mixed emotions. His U-2 had been vindicated in its primary mission. It had provided accurate intelligence about Soviet capabilities and had helped prevent the nuclear war that both sides feared. But it had also demonstrated the dangers of technological hubris, the risk of believing that any weapon or aircraft or strategy could provide perfect security in an imperfect world. We built a plane that could touch heaven, Johnson reflected years later. We forgot that even angels can fall. The U-2 didn't end the Cold War. It didn't stop the fear, but it changed how nations see each other from above. Francis Gary Powers returned to the United States to find a country that no longer quite trusted its own invincibility. The pilot who had flown higher than any human in history became a symbol of the limits of technological superiority, a reminder that in the Cold War, even the most sophisticated advantages could disappear in a moment of miscalculation. He never flew for the CIA again. Instead, he became a test pilot for Lockheed, then a traffic reporter for a Los Angeles television station, flying a helicopter through smoggy skies that seemed impossibly close to Earth after his years in the stratosphere. Powers died in 1977 when his helicopter crashed in the San Fernando Valley, killing him just a few hundred feet above the ground he had spent his career trying to escape. Kelly Johnson continued building impossible aircraft. His SR-71 Blackbird would fly higher and faster than the U-2, but it would never capture the public imagination in quite the same way. The age of the secret spy plane had given way to the age of acknowledged surveillance, where satellites tracked every movement and nations accepted that their secrets could be seen from space. The Soviet Union celebrated its victory over the U-2 for decades, displaying the wreckage in museums and holding Francis Gary Powers up as an example of American aggression. But privately, Soviet leaders understood that the shootdown had marked not just their triumph, but also the beginning of their own vulnerability. If American spy planes could be brought down by Soviet missiles, then Soviet aircraft could be destroyed by American defenses. If the United States could photograph Soviet installations from the edge of space, then the Soviet Union needed to develop its own high-altitude reconnaissance capabilities. The arms race that had driven both nations to build nuclear weapons now expanded into the stratosphere, then into space itself. Every technological advantage was met by a counter-advantage. Every breakthrough in surveillance was matched by a breakthrough in concealment. The laughter that had greeted the U-2's first flights returned occasionally in the years that followed, but it was always nervous laughter, the laughter of nations that understood they lived in a world where invincibility was an illusion and security was always temporary. Today, unmanned aircraft patrol the skies above every conflict zone, gathering intelligence with sensors that would have amazed Kelly Johnson and his team of 80 engineers. Satellites provide real-time imagery of every spot on Earth. Nations spy on each other with a sophistication that makes the U-2's cameras look primitive. But somewhere, above the clouds, the ghost of the Dragon Lady still flies. In every surveillance drone, every spy satellite, every intelligence-gathering system that peers down from the edge of space, there is an echo of that impossible aircraft that proved that humans could build machines to touch the face of heaven. The Soviets laughed once. Then they built their own U-2s. And somewhere, above the clouds, a new kind of war began. The war for sight, the war for knowledge, the war for the ability to see without being seen. It was a war that began with laughter and ended with the understanding that in the modern world, the sky belongs to whoever can climb highest and see farthest. Francis Gary Powers saw farther than any human before him. What he saw changed the Cold War forever. What happened to him changed it in ways that no one had expected. The sky that had seemed infinite became a battlefield. The heavens that had seemed peaceful became a theater of conflict. And the laughter that had seemed so confident became the sound of a world learning that every advantage comes with a price, and every triumph carries the seeds of future defeat. In the end, the story of the U-2 is not just the story of an aircraft or a pilot or even a Cold War crisis. It is the story of human ambition meeting human limitation, of technological triumph confronting political reality, of the eternal tension between the desire to see everything and the impossibility of controlling everything you see. The Dragon Lady flew higher than eagles and fell harder than stone. But in its brief moment of invincibility, it showed the world what was possible when human ingenuity was pushed to its absolute limits. And in its fall, it showed the world what was inevitable when human pride met human vulnerability at 70,000 feet above the earth. The sky is no longer silent. It may never be silent again. But sometimes, on clear days when the air is thin and the horizon seems infinite, you can still hear the whisper of impossible dreams and the echo of laughter that stopped too soon.